Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, here with Sam, and today we're asking why needing to be right can turn a normal correction into a tiny status fight.
Yeah, because once a correction feels like a public loss, people stop hearing the information and start hearing the insult. Identity protective cognition is basically the fancy label for that. When the belief is tied to who you are, accuracy suddenly has a social cost.
That's the problem exactly. If being wrong feels expensive, people will defend the feeling of being right. So let's start with the basic suspicion here, Sam, and pressure test it from the ground up.
Okay, so here's the ugly little core of it. People do not just hate being wrong. They hate what being wrong seems to say about them in front of other people. That is the real tension here. Accuracy versus status. And once you see it, a lot of arguments start looking less like a search for truth and more like a fight over who has to blink first.
That's the cleaner version. Because if we say people only care about winning, that is too crude, and it misses the interesting part. A lot of the time, they care about not looking careless, not looking ignorant, and not looking easy to push around. Those are different pressures, even if they all arrive wearing the same embarrassed face.
And once that pressure shows up, the correction stops feeling like information. It starts feeling like a little public shove. Even something stupidly small, correcting somebody's wording, or the exact detail on a story, or the number they just blurted out, can get weird fast, because the issue is no longer the detail. It is that somebody got to say, actually, and make the other person absorb it.
So the next question is whether that shove is real or just imagined. Because some corrections are genuinely helpful, and some are basically status theater with better grammar. If I tell you you misremembered a date, that can be useful. If I do it in front of a room because I enjoy being the most exact person there, that's not really about the date anymore.
That is exactly the point. The social meaning depends on timing, tone, and audience, not just whether the fact is true. A private correction can be useful. A public correction can also be useful, but it has a built-in humiliation risk. And people are not crazy for reacting to that before they have fully processed the content.
And the annoying part is that both sides can be half right at once. The person correcting might honestly be trying to help, and the person getting corrected might still experience it as a status hit. Those are not the same thing, but they happen in the same room. That's why these conversations get stupid so fast. Everyone thinks they are talking about facts, and half the time, they are actually talking about rank.
Exactly. We keep pretending the fight is about the fact, but often it is about who gets to stand a little higher for 30 seconds. That is why tiny disagreements can suddenly get weirdly personal. Nobody says, I feel socially demoted. They say, actually, that's not what happened. Same energy, cleaner outfit.
That's fair, but I still want the tighter version. Not every correction is dominance. Not every disagreement is ego protection. And not every person who pushes back is secretly fragile. The more useful claim is that being corrected often feels like losing face. And once face is on the table, people stop listening like truth is the goal and start listening like reputation is the goal.
Right, and that feeling shows up in the dumbest places. Somebody corrects your pronunciation, or your memory of a movie quote, or the order of events in a story you were telling, and suddenly, the whole room has a tiny temperature change. Nobody planned a duel, but now the other person has to decide whether to laugh it off, argue back, or make a joke so they do not look rattled.
Which is why I think the distinction matters between useful correction and ego-driven correction. Useful correction improves the conversation or prevents a real mistake. Ego-driven correction mainly proves that somebody was tracking the room more closely than everyone else. Same surface behavior, very different motive. And people can feel the difference even if they cannot name it cleanly.
So you're saying the question is not, did somebody correct someone, because that is too shallow. The real question is what the correction is doing socially. Is it trying to make the thing more accurate, or is it trying to make one person look more competent, more careful, more in charge? Because those are not identical, and people act like they are when it suits them.
That's the useful distinction. And it also explains why people get defensive about tiny errors that look harmless from the outside. Small corrections can feel loaded because they are rarely just about the fact itself. They can imply, I was paying attention, or you were sloppy, or I'm the one who gets to police the detail here. None of that has to be consciously malicious to land as a status move.
Which is why a lot of people do this weird dance where they would rather be imprecise than get publicly corrected. They would rather keep the conversation moving than pause for the tiny accuracy tax. And honestly, that is not always irrational. If every correction becomes a little courtroom, people start protecting their dignity instead of chasing the exact answer.
And that is where I'd stop short of making everybody a villain. Sometimes the correction is just necessary, and sometimes the sensitivity is the problem. But the suspicion is not imaginary. Once truth starts costing social capital, people do start bargaining with it. I think the next question is when that cost is legitimate, and when it is just ego refusing to pay.
Okay, but before we get too abstract about ego, here's the part people actually hate. Correction feels personal fast. The minute somebody says, actually, it can sound less like information and more like, I get to rank you publicly. Nobody says that part out loud, obviously, but it sits under the table anyway.
That's the cleaner version of the discomfort. The correction may be about the facts, but the experience is about status. And those are not the same thing. If it happens privately, somebody can usually take it as useful information. If it happens in front of other people, the same sentence can land like a small public demotion.
Right, because you were wrong is one thing. You were wrong, and now the whole table knows is a different animal. It's not even a subtle bruise. It changes what the rest of the room thinks it saw. And people are not dumb about that, even when they pretend they are.
And even when the correction is technically correct, the meaning changes if it's delivered in front of other people, because now the room is watching your status shift in real time.
Which is exactly why people flinch. It turns into a scoreboard for half a second, and everybody in the room can feel the scoreboard, even if nobody wants to admit that's what it is. That doesn't mean the correction was malicious. It just means the social texture got heavier the second it became public.
That's the part people miss when they say, why can't you just take the correction? Because taking it isn't only about the information. It's about swallowing the awkwardness, the audience, the timing, and sometimes the little extra sting that says, I noticed your mistake first. Those are different costs.
And some people hear that as control, even when the other person didn't mean control. They just hear, you're supposed to sit there and absorb this while I demonstrate that I'm sharper than you. So, Joe, where would you draw the line? When does a correction stop being useful and start being a power move?
I'd draw it at audience and motive, but I'd keep both of those on a short leash. If somebody corrects you one-on-one, gently, and actually seems to care that you understand, that's usually just a correction. If they do it in front of a group, in a tone that seems designed to make you small, then yeah, you're not crazy for hearing status in it. The point is to separate this felt bad from this was definitely a calculated humiliation.
That's fair, because not every person who's corrected is a victim of some secret dominance plot. Sometimes they are just embarrassed and turning that embarrassment into a theory. But the embarrassment still came from somewhere real. It wasn't invented out of thin air. And that's why people get so defensive so quickly.
Exactly. The honest version is that correction can be useful and still feel like a status threat. Private correction gives somebody room to save face. Public correction makes them choose between swallowing it and performing around it. Once you notice that, you can see why the same sentence feels kind in one room and humiliating in another.
And that is why the suspicious reaction isn't just people being fragile for sport. A lot of the time, they're reacting to the social meaning, not just the facts. The facts may be tiny. The face loss is not tiny. So the better question is not, why are people so annoying? It's, what part of this correction is actually about the truth? And what part is about making the other person take a hit?
Yeah, and that question is where the episode gets more honest. Because once you admit that correction can carry status without always being a power play, you stop flattening everybody into either sensitive or controlling. You get the real problem instead. People are often right to feel the social cost, but that still doesn't tell you whether the correction was a fair warning or just somebody enjoying the room too much.
Okay, but before we get too noble about it, the bad first answer is basically, people hate being wrong because their ego is enormous and they're emotionally 14. That's the bumper sticker version.
It's the bumper sticker version because it catches something real. Some people do hear a correction and instantly feel their shoulders go up. The problem is that it explains the reaction too fast.
Because the real feeling isn't just, I want to be right. It's, I do not want to be the idiot in this room. That's less charming, but it's more accurate.
That's the better version. There is harmless pride, and then there's the moment correction turns into a status threat. At that point, the person stops processing information and starts protecting themselves.
So what part of that is actually fair, Joe? Where's the line between self-protection and just being impossible?
The fair part is that public correction can be humiliating, even when it's accurate. If someone feels like the goal is to make them look slow, the correction stops feeling like help. It starts feeling like a little public tax.
Yeah, and people hate paying that. You're not just saying, here's the fact. You're also saying, and by the way, everyone saw you miss it. That second part is where the fight starts.
Exactly. And that doesn't mean they're right to dig in. It means the social pressure is doing some of the work. People can be wrong, embarrassed, and still have a real reason to resist the correction in the moment.
Which is why the lazy answer is too simple. It pretends every defensive reaction is vanity, when sometimes it's just somebody trying not to lose face while everyone else is watching. That isn't noble, but it's also not some giant moral diagnosis.
And sometimes the delivery makes that worse. A clean correction can still land like a tiny victory lap if the other person gets to feel smart and you get to feel managed. Then the conversation is already half about status, even if nobody meant it that way.
That's the ugly little trick. Even when the correction is technically right, it can be framed so the person feels boxed in, like agreeing means admitting they were careless, gullible, or slow. And once that shame gets in the room, the facts have a much harder time doing their job.
Right. So the useful distinction isn't good people accept correction, bad people don't. It's whether they're defending a belief, defending an identity, or defending their place in the room.
And those are not the same move. If we blur them together, we miss the real reason people dig in, which is usually more about status management than the clean, polite story says.
Yeah. The polite story is, we're all just trying to get the facts right. The messier story is that correction can feel like a social loss. And once that happens, the facts have to fight through ego before they get anywhere.
Okay, so here's the split that matters. What people say out loud is usually cleaner than what their behavior is actually protecting. They'll say, I just want the truth. But the uncomfortable version is often, I don't want to look stupid for getting this wrong.
That's the clean version, yes. And to be fair, sometimes they really do want the truth. The point isn't that everybody is faking it, it's that the truth and the ego can be in the same room at once. That is where the conversation gets messy, because people hear one part and pretend the other part isn't there.
Sure, but the social story is always the noble one. Nobody says, I need to win this because I can't stand being wrong in front of people. They say,
I just want the truth. Right. That's the polite packaging.
And the packaging matters because it lets everybody keep their dignity while the actual motive stays tucked away. If someone gets corrected in a group, suddenly the fight is about accuracy, but the heat is often about the room seeing them lose ground. That's why people defend a bad point too long. Backing off feels like handing the room a little trophy.
Okay, but where would you draw the line? Because face saving explains a lot without explaining everything. If somebody pushes back because the correction is genuinely sloppy, that is not the same thing as a status panic.
The line is whether the correction is actually being judged on its merits or on who gets embarrassed by it. If you tell me quietly that I got a detail wrong, I can hear the detail. If you jump in front of a room and make it a public correction, now I'm dealing with the fact that everybody saw me miss it. Same fact, very different pressure.
That's the part I think people miss. Being corrected in front of others is not just more information. It can feel like getting moved down a rung while everybody watches. Not because the fact itself is humiliating, but because the social signal is. The room is not neutral in that moment, even if the fact is perfectly boring.
And then they act like their resistance is all about principle. Sometimes it is, but sometimes principle is just the suit the emotion put on before it came to work. That's why you can watch somebody become weirdly stubborn over a tiny point that 2 minutes later, no one will care about. They are not defending a worldview so much as defending the fact that they were seen losing.
Let me sharpen that a little, though. The honest version is not always, I don't care about the facts. More often it's, I care about the facts, and I also care a lot about not looking careless. Those can be happening at the same time, which is why people can sound righteous and still be mostly defending their self-image.
That's fair, and the everyday version is painfully normal. Somebody argues too long about a restaurant or a plan or a piece of trivia, and the second they can save face without an audience, they suddenly become a lot less committed to the hill they were dying on. It's not that the original point was fake. It's that the social cost was doing half the driving.
And that is still different from saying they're lying on purpose. That's the distinction worth keeping alive. Intent and behavior are not the same thing, and neither are sincerity and good faith. Somebody can mean it when they say they want the truth, then react like a cornered animal when the truth threatens the image they had in the room.
Right, and that is why the sentence, I'm just being honest, is not automatically impressive. Honest about what? The facts, maybe. Or honest about the fact that they cannot tolerate the hit to their status if they admit they were wrong in public. Those are very different kinds of honesty, and people blur them whenever it helps them sound cleaner than they are.
Exactly, and that's why I don't want to flatten this into everyone is fake. A better test is whether the person can absorb the correction once the audience is gone, or whether they only become reasonable when the social cost disappears. If the answer changes with the room, then the room was part of the argument all along.
Okay, so let's do the less flattering version of this, because I think the polite version misses the whole fight. There are two completely reasonable things happening when somebody gets corrected in a disagreement. Either they think the correction is wrong, or they feel the correction as a social hit. And people keep acting like only one of those is real, which is how you end up talking past the actual problem.
That's the useful split. Because if you collapse them, you get this fake, clean story where one person is just a truth machine and the other person is just ego. Real people are messier than that. And disagreement has a status layer whether everybody admits it or not. You can call it pride, face, rank, whatever. The mechanism is still there.
My version is still that accuracy should matter more. If you're wrong, you're wrong. If somebody has the better answer, the mature move is to take the hit and update, not treat every correction like a personal ambush. A lot of people say they care about truth, then the second they're contradicted, they suddenly care a lot about tone, timing, and whether they feel respected enough to hear it.
Sure, but that assumes the correction lands in a vacuum. It doesn't. People hear it in front of other people, or from somebody they already feel one down around, or in a moment where backing down feels like giving up ground. That doesn't make them right, but it does explain why the argument gets hotter than the facts alone would predict. The social meaning arrives with the correction, whether you invited it or not.
So what part of that is actually fair, Joe? Because status can become the excuse for everything. If I tell someone they're mistaken and they get defensive, I don't want to automatically translate that into, yes, the ancient human fear of losing face. Sometimes they're just being stubborn and don't want to admit a miss. Sometimes the correction is clumsy, sure, but sometimes the receiver is just allergic to being wrong out loud.
That's fair. Not every defensive reaction is a deep social drama, and not every correction is a status negotiation. But the status part is real enough that ignoring it makes your theory bad. People are often deciding in the moment whether being corrected means learning something or looking small. That choice changes the whole temperature of the room. And if you pretend that never happens, you miss why perfectly factual comments still blow up.
I'll give you that narrow point. The problem is when I feel corrected turns into I was disrespected. And then suddenly, the person isn't defending the claim anymore, they're defending their image. That's where being right starts acting like a little status costume. It's not always fake, but it's often bigger than the evidence deserves. And everybody in the room can feel that shift.
And I'd add the reverse. Sometimes the person doing the correcting is not just trying to help. Sometimes they like the clean little feeling of being the one who knows. That doesn't mean the correction is false. It means the motive can be mixed, which is exactly why these moments get so slippery. A person can be technically right and still be enjoying the social angle a little too much.
Yeah, that's the part people don't say out loud. A correction can be accurate and still be used as a way to climb one rung higher in the conversation. Same facts, different vibe. And once you know that, you stop pretending every correction is automatically generous. It also means you can ask a better question than just, was the statement true?
Right, because intent, impact, pattern, and exception are four different things. Intent is what the person says they were doing. Impact is how it landed. Pattern is whether they do this all the time. Exception is whether this one moment really is different. If you mash all four together, you end up accusing or excusing way too much.
Okay, then where would you draw the line? Because I don't want to use status as a magic word that explains every annoying correction in the universe, but I also don't want to be naive and pretend nobody ever uses being right to protect themselves socially. There has to be some point where the pattern is strong enough that you're not just talking about style anymore.
I think the line is whether the correction still matters when nobody gets embarrassed by it. If the answer is yes, that's probably the truth-seeking version. If the answer is no, or if the person only seems energized when they get to look smarter, then you're probably in status territory. Not proof of bad intent, just a reason to be cautious about what role the correction is really playing.
I can buy that with one warning. People use status as a lazy, all-purpose explanation too. Not every awkward correction is some little power play. Sometimes it's just a blunt person being blunt and the other person hates the feeling. So the useful version of this isn't everyone is performing. It's some corrections are about information and some are about how the room is arranged.
That's the right guardrail. The status read should explain the moments where correction is doing real social work, changing who looks smart, who looks small, who gets to steer the room. Not become a blanket insult every time somebody pushes back. So the tension stays real. Accuracy matters, but the social cost of correction is part of why people fight so hard about it.
Okay, but if we want something sturdier than vibes, the next question is what actually happens when somebody gets corrected in front of other people? Because that is where the whole thing stops being about the fact and starts being about the room.
The clean version is that a correction is rarely just information. If it lands like embarrassment or status loss, people start defending themselves instead of updating. And that is a very different job for the brain.
Fact.
Exactly. There is a decent amount of psychology around identity protective cognition, which is a fancy way of saying people protect beliefs that feel tied to who they are or to the group they belong to. Once a belief starts carrying identity weight, evidence does not arrive as neutral information anymore.
So the brain hears, "You might be wrong," and translates it into, "You just made me look stupid." That is annoyingly human. Nobody wants to be corrected like they were a typo.
That is the useful distinction. The claim is not that people love being inaccurate. It's that accuracy can come with a social price, and people hate paying that price in front of an audience. At that point, the argument is no longer only about truth. It is also about face, competence, and who gets to feel above the room.
So what part of that is actually fair, and what part is us being cynical with better vocabulary? Because I buy the status piece, but I do not want to turn every disagreement into a tiny public humiliation event.
The fair version is narrower than the cynical version. It is not every correction, and it is not everybody. It shows up most when the belief is tied to identity, reputation, or group belonging. There is a 2024 study showing that identity-linked beliefs were much harder to change when people were confronted with contrary evidence, and a counterfactual mindset made people more willing to revise.
That tracks. The minute a fact touches your self-image, your brain stops behaving like it is there to learn and starts behaving like it is there to protect you. And once that happens, the dumb little disagreement is no longer just about the disagreement.
No, and that is why the social threat piece matters too. In experiments, people who felt socially excluded later judged wrongdoers more harshly, which is a good reminder that a slight can produce a bigger defensive reaction than the original mistake. The correction becomes the trigger, but the real reaction is about what it says about your standing.
So the ordinary version is not some grand psychological mystery. It is somebody feeling exposed, then getting sharp, then doubling down because backing up would feel worse in the moment.
Usually, yes. And public correction is worse than private correction for exactly that reason. Private correction lets someone keep their dignity while they absorb the information. Public correction turns it into an audience problem. And once there is an audience, the cost of admitting error goes way up. That is also why psychologically safe environments matter so much. People need to be able to ask for help or admit mistakes without feeling like they are getting punished for it.
That is the piece that sticks. It's not just I'm wrong, it's I'm wrong in front of witnesses. And once you say that out loud, a lot of ordinary stubbornness looks less mystical and more like face-saving.
Right, and that is where the conversation gets useful, because the next question is when that reflex gets rewarded. If the room teaches people that certainty is safer than accuracy, then the digging in is not just a personal quirk. It is a habit the environment keeps training.
Okay, but let's separate the feeling from the mechanism. The feeling is, this person is being obnoxiously certain. The mechanism is that certainty often pays, at least socially. That's the annoying part. People don't always cling to a bad answer because they love the bad answer. Sometimes they cling to the answer that looks safest in the room.
That's the cleaner version. Confidence reads as competence, and uncertainty can read as a discount on your credibility. So if you're trying to survive a conversation, especially one with an audience, the person who sounds steady often gets treated as more legitimate before anyone checks whether they're actually right.
So the first reward is immediate. Nobody has to squint at the person who sounds sure. They get to move the conversation forward as if they already earned the right to do that. Meanwhile, the person who's careful looks like they're slowing everyone down, even if they're the one being accurate.
And that matters in ordinary life more than people like to admit. In a lot of disagreements, nobody is doing a formal truth audit. They're reacting to tone, confidence, and who seems willing to absorb the awkwardness. So the person who admits error can end up paying the social fee even when they are doing the responsible thing.
Is that the whole trick, or is there also status in making the other person back down? Because that feels like the real engine sometimes. Not just, I don't want to lose, but I want you to be the one visibly losing.
That's definitely part of it. Social responses to being wrong aren't only about principle. They can carry payoff. There are situations where direct correction gives the corrector a little status bump, a reputation bump, or just the satisfaction of not being the one who folded first. So, yes, people can learn that standing firm has its own reward.
Which is why the room gets so dumb so fast. The person who could say, I missed that, has to weigh the actual issue against the immediate hit to face. And if everybody else is watching, conceding starts to feel less like learning and more like volunteering to be smaller.
Exactly. Public correction changes the math. A 2026 study found that correcting misinformation could reduce perceived credibility, and even expressing uncertainty could make a source look less credible at the start. So, the social penalty can be real enough that people choose certainty first, then protect the story later.
That's the gross little trade-off. I might be wrong, sounds honest in a calm conversation, but in a heated one, it can sound like you're handing the other person a free win. And once that feeling shows up, people stop treating accuracy like the goal and start treating survival like the goal.
And online, the pressure gets worse. because the whole thing is visible. You don't just have the original claim and the correction, you have the audience watching, who stumbled, who stayed composed, and who looked foolish. That kind of environment rewards posturing because the reputational cost is on display for everybody at once.
Which is how you end up with people acting like the most important thing is never giving the room a clean shot at them. They'd rather sound immovable than sound responsive. And I get why. If you get corrected in public, it can feel less like good catch and more like getting demoted in front of a crowd.
That's the part people miss when they make it a character flaw only. Sometimes the environment is doing the teaching. If the fastest way to lose face is to be the first one to qualify a claim, then confidence starts looking like self-defense instead of vanity. That doesn't excuse every stubborn person, but it does explain why the behavior keeps reproducing.
So the fair complaint isn't everyone is fake, it's that the incentives push people towards sounding certain even when humility would be better. That means the useful question isn't whether confidence is bad, it's whether the confidence is backed by real information or just by not wanting to look rattled.
Yeah, that's the line worth keeping. Confidence isn't automatically a lie, and uncertainty isn't automatically wisdom. But if somebody only seems brave when their status is untouched, that tells you something. The next question is where the line gets drawn between fair correction and just using being right as a dominance move. Okay, so the line isn't never correct people. It's more like, are you trying to help them get it right? Or are you trying to make them feel small for getting it wrong? Because those are different motives, even if the sentence sounds clean either way.
And people hide behind the clean sentence all the time. I'm just being honest can mean I'm trying to be useful. Or it can mean I want the social win and I want a receipt for it. Same words, very different animal.
That's the useful split. A real correction usually makes the thing clearer, smaller, or safer. A status correction makes the person feel exposed, and it often does that in front of other people because that's where the win is. Not always, but that's the pattern you watch for. Exactly. If the same point can be made privately and you choose a public humiliation anyway, you should probably admit the audience mattered. That doesn't prove cruelty by itself, but it does tell you the correction wasn't only about accuracy.
And that's where people get slippery. They turn a tiny factual cleanup into a tiny moral win, then act shocked when the other person stops listening to the fact and starts defending their pride. Nobody likes being corrected, but nobody likes being used as a prop either.
Right, because context decides a lot. If this is a safety issue, a work decision, something that affects other people, or a repeated pattern, being direct is not a vanity project. But if it's a minor slip, a dumb preference, or a harmless typo, then jumping on it in real time can be more about display than help.
So private first, almost always, or do you think there are cases where public correction is just the right move and the embarrassment is the price of honesty? I think people use public like it's automatically evil, which is also kind of lazy.
Private first is a good default when the stakes are low and the relationship matters. Public correction earns its keep when the mistake is material, repeated, or already steering the group wrong. The line is not never embarrass anybody. The line is don't use the truth as an excuse to enjoy the hit.
That last part is the part people hate hearing because they can feel the difference and still pretend not to. The correction may be accurate, but the delivery can still be a little victory lap, and everybody in the room knows it.
And curiosity versus cruelty can sound annoyingly alike. Both ask questions. Both can stay calm. Both can use the same facts. The difference is whether the question opens the idea up or corners the person. If your just asking only leaves them options that make them look dumb, you're not exploring anything.
That's the part people miss. Curiosity has room in it. Cruelty wants a performance, even if it dresses up like concern. You can hear it when somebody asks a question they don't actually want answered. They just want the other person to stumble into the trap already built for them.
So is the clean rule really about audience and stakes? Or is it also about whether you'd be willing to say the same thing if the goal was genuinely to help? Because those are close, but not identical.
I think it's both. Match the correction to the relationship, the stakes, and the setting. And if the setting is doing most of the work, that's usually the red flag. If you only needed to say it with witnesses, you might not be defending the truth so much as feeding the room. Correct for clarity, not for theater.
That's the usable version. Keep the correction when it actually changes the decision, the understanding, or the risk. Save the public version for when silence would leave everybody else worse off. And if you're not sure, ask whether you're fixing the point or shopping for a small humiliation.
Okay, but once we admit there's a line between fair correction and cheap dunking, we have to say the ugly part out loud. The audience helps pay for the cheap dunking. That's the uncomfortable bit, because it means this isn't just some villain at the top making everybody stupid. A lot of us reward the person who sounds most certain, and we treat the visible mistake like it's free entertainment.
That's the cleaner version of the critique. And to be fair, it's not that people consciously wake up and say, I want a public humiliation today. It's more like they instinctively like being on the side that gets to correct, because it feels like competence, and competence has status. So the social reward is real, even when the intent is pretty ordinary.
Yeah, and that's why a comments thread or a group chat can go sideways so fast. Nobody gets points for saying, hang on, let me check that first. The person who fires off the sharpest correction looks like the adult in the room, even when they're only half right. Or in a work meeting, somebody says the wrong number and 3 people suddenly want to prove they noticed it first. Joe, am I overstating it if I say people don't just want truth, they want the feeling of being the one who caught the error?
I think that's mostly right, with one caveat. It's not everybody, and it's not every setting. In a family argument or a workplace meeting, sometimes people really do want the answer. But in a lot of public settings, the emotional reward is getting to be the person who is right first, loudly, in front of other people. That's different from accuracy, and people act like it's the same thing because it flatters them.
That's the part I keep coming back to. We like to pretend correction is always some noble truth service, but a lot of the time it's social sorting. Who gets to look smart? Who gets to look careless? Who gets to look like they were paying attention all along? And once that starts, the mistake itself stops being the main event. The main event becomes the ranking, and everybody pretends that's just a side effect.
Exactly. And that's what makes the pile-on sticky. One person makes a mistake, and suddenly everyone wants a little piece of the status gain from noticing it. It's not always cruel, but it's also not clean. There's a difference between accountability, which tries to fix the error, and spectacle, which keeps the mistake alive because the crowd likes the feeling. So where do you draw the line then? At what point does normal correction become enjoying the social win? Because I think that's the question people avoid. Nobody thinks of themselves as part of the problem. They think, I'm just being accurate. And maybe sometimes they are. But a lot of messy behavior hides inside that sentence.
I'd say the line is pretty simple in theory, which is annoying because people hate simple rules, when they make them look worse. If someone's wrong and you correct it once so the conversation can move on, that's one thing. If the correction turns into everyone taking turns to prove they noticed it too, then the goal shifted. At that point, you're not helping the other person understand. You're helping the room enjoy the correction.
That's the useful test. It doesn't require purity, just honesty about motive. If you'd be satisfied with a private correction, you're probably in decent shape. If you only care because you get to say it in front of people, that should make you pause. Not because public correction is automatically bad, but because the extra audience changes what you're getting out of it.
Right. And that's why I'm not saying stop correcting people. I'm saying notice the little hit of pleasure. If your first thought is, gotcha, maybe the truth isn't the only thing you're after. That's not a confession of evil. It's just a sign that being right and being seen being right can start to blur together really fast.
And the audience part matters because people laugh, nod, pile on, and that teaches everyone what gets rewarded. Nobody wants to be the person who says, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be, because that can sound soft. But sometimes that's the adult move. You can still hold someone accountable without turning every mistake into a public lesson.
That's the uncomfortable self-awareness. Not I'm a bad person, just I like being right too, and the room makes that feeling easier to indulge. The smarter version of the critique is that we all feed it a little, especially when the mistake is public and the correction costs us nothing. So if we want this to get less gross, we probably have to stop pretending our own enjoyment is invisible.
That's where I land too. Keep the accountability, drop the extra cruelty, and don't lie to yourself about why the room feels good when somebody else is wrong. That's probably the cleanest standard we've got before we get into what would actually change the behavior.
Okay, so if we've already admitted this is mostly about status, the next question is the useful one. What actually makes correction feel less like a little public downgrade? Because I don't think people are sitting around thinking, please sharpen my thinking today. They're thinking, don't make me look dumb in front of the same people who were nodding a second ago.
And not be nicer, because that's the lazy version. You mean what changes the setup so the correction can land without turning into a face-saving contest?
Yeah. And Joe, am I overstating the status part, or is that basically the engine here? Because people act like they're debating facts, but half the time they're guarding the version of themselves that was already talking, and that version does not want to get hauled off stage in public.
That's the clean version. The fix isn't stop having egos. That would be adorable, but useless. It's lowering the penalty for updating in front of other people. If the social cost of changing your mind is huge, then the room is basically training people to fake certainty. So the practical question is, how do you make correction cheaper without pretending nobody cares what they look like?
One answer is private correction when you can get away with it. If the issue is small and the audience doesn't need the spectacle, there's no prize for making somebody eat it in public. You can still be honest, but you don't have to turn every mistake into a group project where everyone gets to watch the correction happen in slow motion.
That's the right first move. And when public correction is unavoidable, the order matters. Lead with the truth. Explain why the old claim doesn't hold, then give the replacement explanation. A simple no is emotionally tidy and practically useless. People don't just need the error removed. They need something coherent enough to stand in its place, or they just keep the old belief with better posture.
That replacement piece is huge. If you only knock down the bad answer, you leave the other person with embarrassment and no exit, which is how they end up defending nonsense just to keep their footing. It's not that they love being wrong. It's that the room gave them no dignified way to become less wrong.
And asking for alternatives works better than cornering people. What else could explain it? Or what would have to be true for your version to work? Gives them a path to revise without making the revision feel like surrender. There's some actual evidence behind that general move, too. Prompting people to consider alternatives makes them more willing to take in accurate facts instead of just bracing against the correction.
It's a less humiliating door in. Nobody loves being corrected, but people can tolerate being guided somewhere if it doesn't feel like they're being stripped of rank in front of the whole room. That's the part I think gets missed. The ideal isn't enjoy the feedback, it's don't make the feedback feel like a public ranking of your worth.
And the environment has to support that. In a workplace or group where uncertainty gets punished, people will fake confidence. In a place that makes "I might be wrong" survivable, better answers show up faster. That's the ordinary setting fix people skip. You do not get honesty on command. You get it when the room stops treating hesitation like a character flaw.
Okay, but where's the line? When does private correction become avoidance, and when does public correction become just a fancy way to win the room?
If the mistake is small, contained, and doesn't need an audience to be fixed, private is usually better. If the wrong claim is already shaping the group's decision or everyone's understanding, then it has to be corrected in the open. But still, in a way that sounds procedural, not triumphant. The point is to update the record, not to make somebody perform humility for sport.
So the goal isn't emotional perfection. It's making correction feel like information instead of a status attack, which is a much smaller promise and a much more realistic one. Lead with the truth, give the replacement, use the softer entry point when you can, and don't make every disagreement into a little humiliation ceremony. That's not paradise. It's just less stupid. So I think we've landed in the annoying but honest middle. People are supposed to care about accuracy, but in a real disagreement, being wrong can feel like getting socially mugged.
That's the clean version. Not everyone is chasing ego on purpose, but a lot of situations make correction feel expensive, so people defend themselves first and think later.
And that's the part I keep coming back to. A lot of arguments are presented like a search for truth, but the hidden job is often status management. Don't look stupid, don't lose face, don't hand the other person a little victory lap.
Sure, but I'd be careful with the word often. It's not that people are always choosing pride over accuracy. Sometimes they're reacting to the room they're in, and the room makes honesty feel risky.
Fair. The intent isn't always villainous, but the effect is still the same a lot of the time. If the social cost of being wrong is high, people will spend energy protecting themselves instead of updating fast.
That's the key distinction. Intent, impact, pattern, exception. If you blur those together, you end up calling every awkward correction a moral failure. And that's not honest either.
So the better question is not, are people lying? It's, what happens to them when they admit they missed it? Because that's where the whole thing gets real.
Exactly. And when the answer is humiliation, loss of face, or being treated like you owe the room an apology tour, of course people get defensive.
Joe, am I overstating it when I say that a lot of people would rather be defended as correct than become more correct?
No, that's the useful version. I would just say a lot of people in a lot of settings, because the room matters. But yes, the status protective move is often stronger than the truth-seeking move.
That's the part that bugs people, I think. We like to imagine we'd welcome correction like mature adults, and then somebody points out we're wrong, and suddenly we're negotiating with our own identity.
And that's where the practical fix lives. You don't need a world where nobody cares about being right. You need a world where being corrected doesn't automatically mean you lose standing.
Right, because if every correction turns into a status event, nobody learns anything. They just get better at looking unbothered, which is a terrible substitute for understanding.
And that's the usable takeaway here. If you want people to be more accurate, you have to lower the social price of being wrong. Not to zero, that's fantasy, but low enough that admitting a miss doesn't feel like public surrender.
Yeah, because once being wrong feels survivable, people can actually start telling the truth to themselves. That's the whole trick, annoying as it is.
And that's probably where we leave it. Don't confuse the urge to be right with the ability to be accurate. And don't assume every correction is about ego. But don't pretend ego isn't doing a lot of the work either. That wraps up today's question. We're glad you listened to Say the Question. Make sure you're following so you catch the next one tomorrow.